So you saw that Flexbox makes it incredibly easy to lay out a bunch of elements in a row or in a column. But sometimes we need to lay out content in both rows and columns. That's where we use grids. A very common application of grids is in creating photo galleries. So here we have a bunch of photos. Now don't worry about the size of these photos. Yes, some of them are bigger, some are smaller, but all these photos are laid out on a grid. Here's the grid. We have 4 rows and 3 columns. Here's another example. A typical layout for most websites. We have a header on the top, a sidebar on the left, the content area, and the footer. We can use a grid to lay out these building blocks. Now, can you tell me the dimension of this grid? How many rows and columns should we have for this layout? 3 rows and 2 columns. So let's see how we can define a grid. To define a grid, first we need a container. On the container, we're going to set the display property to grid, and then we're going to use these 2 properties to define the number and size of rows and columns. So we're going to start by defining a div with the class of container. So we can type dot container and press tab. This automatically generates a div. So there is no need to explicitly type div. Okay, just a little tip for you. Now let's define some styles. So we define a rule and set the display property to grid. Now let's say we want to create a 3 by 2 grid, 3 rows and 2 columns. Here we use grid template rows property to define the number and size of rows. So let's say each row should be 100 pixels tall. Here we type 100 pixels, 100 pixels, and 100 pixels. Of course, we can change the size or the unit. That is irrelevant. So for now, let's keep things simple and use 100 pixels. Similarly, we have another property for defining the number and size of columns. We're going to have 2 columns, each 100 pixels. Okay. Now, here I'm also going to apply a border of 3 pixels, solid, light gray, so we can easily see what is going on. Back to the browser. Here's our container. Now, in this demo, I'll put DevTools on the right side. Okay. Now, here in the DOM, look at the container element. Next to it, we have the grid badge. If you don't see this, that means you're using an older version of DevTools. So on the top, under the Chrome menu, go to About Google Chrome. Over here, Chrome is going to automatically update to the latest version. So the version I'm using is version 87. Okay. Now, here we can click the grid badge to toggle the grid overlay. So here you can see we have a grid of 3 rows and 2 columns. Now over here, we have the layout tab, which is next to the computer tab. On this tab, we can set the options for our grid. So here we have this dropdown. We can show line numbers. So now we can see the line number for each row and column. So we have line 1, line 2, line 3, and so on. We can also see track sizes. So tracks means rows or columns. So currently you can see each column is 100 pixels wide. The same is true for rows, right? Now we can also see area names. We'll talk about that later. Now down below, we can see all elements that contain a grid. So currently we have a single element that includes a grid, but on a real web page, you might have multiple grids on the same page. So over here, you can select or deselect these items and look at them with detail. We can also change the color of the overlay. Okay. So I'm going to keep things simple and hide the line numbers as well as the track sizes. Okay. Now earlier I told you that we don't want duplication in our code. If tomorrow we decide to change the size of our columns, there are 2 places we have to modify. A better approach here is to use the repeat function. So here we can call the repeat function, give it a number like 2 and a size. So now we have a single place to modify if we decide to change the size of our columns. Similarly, we can simplify this expression to repeat 3 100 pixels. Okay. Now we have another property called grid template, which is the shorthand for grid template rows and columns. So first we specify the template for our rows, which is repeat 3 100 pixels. Then we add a / and type the template for our columns. So repeat 2 100 pixels. Now some people prefer the shorthand syntax. Other people prefer the more explicit syntax. This is entirely up to you. I personally prefer the shorthand syntax most of the time. Not always, but most of the time. So I'm going to clean up this code. This is what we have. Now let's add a bunch of items in our grid. So back to our markup. In a real scenario, here we could have elements like header, main, footer, and so on. But for this demo, I just want to add a bunch of abstract boxes, so we don't get distracted with these complexities. So how many boxes do we want? 4 boxes. Now, let's give each box a label. Now let's define some styles. So here's a rule. We're going to give each box a width of 5 rem, a height of 5 rem as well, and a background color of gold. So here's what we get. As you can see, these items are automatically placed from top left to bottom right. But we have full control over the placement of these items. And this is incredibly powerful when it comes to mobile. Because on mobile, we don't want to have the same layout as what we have on desktop. So we want to move elements around. We want to move something to the top or bottom or hide it. We can easily do these things in grids. Now let's talk about alignment. So I'm going to toggle the grid overlay. Note that each box or each grid item, more accurately, is aligned to the top left corner of its containing cell. But we can easily align these items along the horizontal or vertical axis. So here we have 2 properties you need to remember. Justify items for aligning along the horizontal axis, and align items for aligning along the vertical axis. So these properties are kind of similar to the properties we had in the lesson about Flexbox, but in Flex, instead of justify items, we had justify content. In grids, we also have justify content. We're going to talk about that in a second. But these 2 properties are the ones you use most of the time. So back to our container, we want to align our items along the horizontal axis. So we set justify items to. We can set it to start, end, center, and so on. So let's set it to center. Now each box is in the center of the horizontal axis, right? Now we can set align items to align these items along the vertical axis. Once again, we have start, end, center, and so on. So I'm going to set it to center. Now each box is in the center of its containing cell. Now look at this grid. Our grid is currently aligned to the left side of its container, but we have 2 extra properties for aligning the grid inside its container. So we have justify content. Once again, we can set this to start, end, center, and so on. So let's set it to center. Our grid is now horizontally centered. We also have align content for vertical alignment. Now, if I set this to center, nothing is going to happen because the container has grown tall enough to fit the grid. So there is no extra vertical space. We can go back to our container and set the height to 100 VH or 100% of the viewport height. So now we have some space on the top and on the bottom. And our grid is perfectly centered inside this container. So here's how you should remember these properties. If you see the word content, that represents the entire grid, the entire content. But if you see the word items, that represents individual items in the grid, okay? Now, for simplicity, let's remove these 2 properties. So we're not going to align the grid as a whole. And here's what we get. Now, for these 2 properties, I want you to remember the default value. The default value of both these properties is stretch. But currently, nothing happens if we set this to stretch. Look, we get the same result as before. The reason this is happening is because we've applied an explicit width and height on our boxes. So if we remove the width property, with justify items set to stretch, our box is going to stretch horizontally to fill its containing cell. Take a look. So each box is horizontally stretched, right? Now similarly, if we remove the height property and set align items to stretch, each item will vertically stretch. So as a result, our boxes have filled their containing cell, okay? Now, as I told you, stretch is the default value, so there's really no need to explicitly set these properties. So we can simplify our code and get the same result, okay? Next, we're going to get rid of these absolute values. So I want the first column to take 30% of the space and the second column to take 70%. So here we can say 30% and 70%. So look, the the first column and the second column. However, percentages are a little bit tricky when working with grids, because if you have another column here that has an absolute length, let's say 100 pixels, see what happens. Our grid has grown larger than its container, because percentage is based on the width of the container. But what we need here is a percentage of the available free space. So after we allocate 100 pixels for the first column, we have some free space left in the container. We want 30% of the free space, not 30% of the width of the container, okay? So that's where another unit comes to the play, that is FR, or fraction. This means a fraction of the available space. So as a best practice, prefer fractions to percentages when setting sizes of rows and columns. Now, let's get rid of this. For our rows, we're going to have 3 rows. The first row is going to be 100 pixels. I want the second row, which is the container for the sidebar and the main content, to grow and fill the entire space. So here we use the auto keyword. And for the footer, we can use 100 pixels as well. So here's the first row, the second row, and the third row. Now, if I resize this window, look, the second row is being resized while the first and last rows have kept their absolute length, which is 100 pixels. Now, currently our grid cells are right next to each other, but we can apply a gap between rows and columns. For this, we have 3 properties: row gap, column gap, and gap, which is the shorthand for the first 2 properties. So back to our container, we can set row gap to 10 pixels. And now we have a gap of 10 pixels between each row. Let me turn off the overlay so you can see clearly. See, this is the gap. We can also apply a gap between the columns. So we set column gap to 10 pixels. And here's the gap. We also have the gap property, which is the shorthand for row gap and column gap. Now, if you want to use the same value, we can just supply a single value. So that is shorter than setting 2 separate properties, okay? Now let's talk about placing items in a grid. For this, we have 3 properties: grid row, grid column, and grid area, which is the shorthand for grid row and grid column. By setting these properties on an item, we can control where exactly that item should be placed. For example, let's say we want the first item to take the entire first row. So first we go to our markup and give this item an extra class like box1. Now let's define a role here. So for box1, here we can set the column to 2. Let's see what happens. So the first item moved to the second column. Here we have an empty cell, and look at the placement of other items. The other items are automatically placed from top left to bottom right, okay? Now let's move it back to the first column. By default, each item takes 1 cell, but if you want an item to take more than 1 cell, here we type a / and then type the end line number. So let's go back to DevTools. Here on the Layout tab, I'm going to show the line numbers. So where are they? We have to show the overlay. All right, look at the line numbers. So line number 1, 2, and 3. So we want the first item, which is A, start from line 1 and end at line 3. So here we type 1/3, and here's the result. Beautiful. Now we can also count backward. So -1 represents the last column. So 3 or -1 are the same thing, okay? So now we get the same result. Now here we can also use the span keyword to specify how many cells this item is going to take. We can say it's going to span 2 cells. In this case, we get the same result. So what approach you choose is purely your personal preference. Different people find different syntaxes more readable, okay? Now similarly, we have another property, grid row. We can move this box to the second row, and look what happens. So the first box is now in the second row, and the other boxes are automatically placed from top left to bottom right. Now similarly, we can say this item should start from row 2 and go up to row 4. Now it's taking 2 rows. Or we can say it's going to span 2 rows. That's another way. Now let's move it back to the first row. We don't need to explicitly set this because by default, this item is placed on the first row. Then we also have grid area property, which has a weird syntax, but let me quickly explain how it works. So here we have to type 4 numbers, start and end, and each part contains a row and a column. What do I mean by this? Well, this item is going to be in row 1, column 1, and go all the way to row 1, column 3. So here we type 1 and 1, that is row 1, column 1. Then we go to row 1, column 3. So the first 2 numbers represent the start, and the second 2 numbers represent the end. It has a really weird syntax. I don't find it readable, so I personally prefer to use individual properties like grid row or grid column. Another way to place items is by defining specific areas in our grid and then placing our items in those areas. We have 2 properties for doing this. We set grid template areas on our container to define the areas. And then on individual items, we set grid area to a particular area. So back to our container, let's set grid template areas. Here we type a pair of double quotes. That represents the template for the first row. In the first row, we're going to have 2 cells. We can give each cell a name. For example, header and header. That means these 2 cells in the first row are going to be called header. Now, after this, we type another pair of quotes and type the name of the cells in the second row. So here you want to have a sidebar and the main area. So we type sidebar and main. The names are arbitrary. You can call them anything you want. Now for the last row, we're going to have 2 cells, footer and footer. So we type another pair of quotes and say footer and footer. Now, if we format our code like this is not really readable. So it's better to put this on a new line. Now we can see the template for each row. We can also add extra spaces to format this properly. So we have defined a few different areas: header, sidebar, main, and footer. Now we can put the first box in the header area. So we set grid area to header. Note that I just typed the area name without the quotes. We don't need the quotes here. If we type them, it's not going to work. So instead of specifying the exact location by number, we can type the location by name. Now we get the same result as before. Now similarly, we can go to our markup and give the last item an extra class like box4. Then here we define a new rule and say box4 should be in the area called footer. So this will automatically take that area, which contains 2 footer cells. Now, what if we want the footer to start from here? I know this is not typical for most websites, but let's just imagine the footer should start here. So here we want to have an empty cell. Here in our template, to specify an empty cell, we type a period. Now, our footer area only contains 1 cell. So with this simple change, this box moved over here. So grids are very powerful. We can create all kinds of layouts with grids, and when it comes to mobile, we can move these items around and come up with a different layout. Now, one last thing before we finish this lesson. Here on the Layout tab, we can also look at the area names. Let's toggle the overlay. All right, take a look. Here's the main area. We have the sidebar, footer, and so on. I just want to emphasize one more time. Just like the Flexbox, don't let all these properties intimidate you. Once you build 1 or 2 layouts using Grid or Flexbox, you're going to get the hang of them. It's much easier than you think.